we're going to start with Moon Duchin, who will talk with us a little bit about statistical tests that can be used to evaluate maps, either during the drawing process or after adoption. So after that, we'll switch into some litigation stuff. But for now, Moon, it's yours. And yes, you can have that extra little bit of time. So take it away.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. As you just heard, my name is Moon Duchin. I'm a math professor at Tufts University, and I also run a lab that does redistricting work. So I have a request for you, which is, since I am a professor, I really thrive on explaining something and then getting questions. So I'm going to really try to leave a couple minutes for questions at the end of my short presentation, and then my request to you is that you try and see if you have any. Okay, so, here we go. All right, so the first part of my remarks I called Unleash the Computers. This is just a little bit of context of what computers bring to the table, as it were, when you're thinking about redistricting. Okay, so I'll be talking about something called the ensemble method, which broadly is taking a redistricting plan and putting it in the context of what else you could have done. Not an abstract ideal, but the actual other possibilities. So first I'll say that this has been a dream in redistricting for 50 plus years. So at least since the 1960s, you'll see computer scientists, political scientists, kind of writing articles where they say, with all the computing power, growth in computing power, we should be able to just tell a computer what we want. In other words, program in the criteria for the map, let the computer enumerate all the possibilities, all the ways to satisfy all of the rules. And then when you have those plans, you can compare it to the alternatives. And this has been the dream. But as usual, computers can break your heart. So this turns out to be intractable, permanently intractable. So it's not just that computers aren't there yet. It's that the size of the problem is so big that you'd have to wait till literally past the heat death of the universe to pull this off. There are just too many maps. Just to give you a tiny vista in just how big that number is, we're not talking about thousands, we're not talking about trillions. We're talking about something like a 1 in 100 zeros. Okay, so there's just so many maps that even if you had all the particles in the universe working together, you couldn't build all the possibilities. But then here we have a really good way to handle that these days, which is that some people call this simulation, but I prefer the term sampling. You can get your computer to just take a representative sample of all those spaces, all those possible maps. So even if you can't get the, jillions of maps completely enumerated, you can take representative maps from the universe. And then you can use those. That's what I'm going to call an ensemble of maps, that collection of maps that you sample. You can use that to understand how yours behaves. So I think this is a big scientific breakthrough in the last 5 or so years. Now there are multiple teams who are doing scientifically rigorous work to benchmark what's possible for your particular state, for your particular moment, for your particular voter. Okay, so I want to sort of structure my remarks through what I'll call like some myths about how this process works. So one thing that I've heard people say a lot is that these kind of algorithms that transform redistricting plans, that's how they work. They take a plan and they make little transformations and build other plans. So a myth that's out there is that they just make cosmetic changes. But this slide is just a little movie to illustrate that actually there's been some breakthroughs here. So it's not only flipping one little precinct or one little census block at a time, like in the flip chain on the left. But now we have ways to really merge districts together and flip them in a whole new way, like the image on the image that's on the right. And might just have a forthcoming paper coming out about this process. But we also have open source algorithms so that everyone can try this for themselves. So here's an illustration showing you what that would do on a real size problem. So they recognize Pennsylvania and 18 congressional districts. And here the computer is just taking 2 districts at a time, merging them together and splitting them in a new way. And you'll notice that the shapes that it's making are relatively compact. It's forming relatively reasonable shapes. I'll just mention that this is a use case that I know well because the 2018 State Supreme Court challenge to Pennsylvania's congressional card, I was consulting for Governor Wolf who asked me to help analyze the sort of range of what would be possible. Okay, the next myth that I want to address, which is something that I actually believed when I started this research several years ago, is that you need a really fancy computer to do this. The problem is so complicated. And then there's this kind of competing myth that is sometimes held at the same time, which is that it's really easy, that it can be done at the touch of a button. And the truth is somewhere in the middle. On one hand, you don't need a fancy computer. You can get 1 million of the small change plans in just minutes on a laptop. You can get 1 million large change plans, the ones like the movie I showed you on the right, in hours on a cheap laptop with open source algorithms. This isn't fancy on the side of the hardware. But here's the flip side, and for my slogan for this, it's not rocket science, but it is data science. You want an actual scientist to help because the process is involved. There's sort of data analysis to do here. You prepare the data, you think about the rules, you get the algorithm to be sensitive to the rules, you design a target distribution, you launch your own. I don't need to go into the details here. Unless you ask, if you're curious, I'm happy to talk about it. But the idea is that this is an actual process that requires trying things and changing things and trying them again until you have pretty good scientific confidence that you're getting it right. The extra good news, though, is that there are a lot of academic teams involving mathematicians and data scientists who are doing this at a really high level. And the thing that I like to tell folks like you who are actually doing the redistricting is that the really great thing about academics from the point of view of your work is that we're in it for a paper, not a paycheck. So you can get groups that will really support you doing this kind of work without having to pay a great deal for it. The thing for us, too, is that we get access to good, clean data. And so it's an interesting problem for us and hopefully helpful for you in ways that I'll continue to outline. Okay, so the next myth, so-called myth, that I want to address is that you can get a computer to say anything. In other words, if my team does this with one set of reasonable methods, I'll tell you one thing. Another group does it also reasonably, and they get a totally different answer. Or even in a legal setting, you might have the witnesses for the two sides, for the plaintiff and the defense, doing something similar but getting different answers. And the good news is that so far this does not seem to be the case. So, for instance, I and my colleagues filed an amicus brief in which of the common cause last summer, showing that different groups with different methods were replicating each other's results pretty close. And I'll show you a little bit about what those results look like in a few slides. But I'm trying to set it up and sort of frame the work for you first. The last so-called myth that I want to address is that all of this ensemble talk is really about outsourcing redistricting to the computers. And so this myth, the way I framed it here, is that the computer can just find the best plan. You can set the computer loose these days and just find the right and for the best. So I don't think that's the case. There's been a lot of progress thinking about how to quantify criteria, thinking about double bunking or incumbent protection, thinking about VRA compliance, thinking about county splitting. But the computer can't balance those priorities against each other. And so for now, and I think forever, redistricting is still for people. It's still for people who think about the values and the criteria and what's important, and who really know the state, who understand the communities on the ground, and are thinking about those as they do the redistricting. Right, so the techniques that I'm talking about here, I'd really like you to think of them as evaluation techniques, not selection techniques. I don't think that anybody who's responsible in this space is arguing that you should just pick a plan that a computer made and adopt it. They're for telling you how you're doing relative to the alternative. Okay. Last point, before I show you some examples, and I think this is important, you're going to see some bell curves, you're going to see some histograms that show you what's possible. But this isn't a call to be at the top of the bell curve. Being at the top of the bell curve isn't necessarily the goal, but being way out in the tail, the part that I've drawn in red here, being way out in the tail of the distribution and you don't have a good reason to be there, that should raise a flag and make you wonder a little bit about the trade-offs that you made in putting the plan together. Okay, so with all that background, Now let me show you some examples. And these slides are, of course, made available to you in case, as is probably the case, I might be going too fast. But let me show you what this actually looks like. So here I'm just showing you 3 examples from different projects where the algorithm is making compact, contiguous, and population balanced plans. So the caveat is, for these pictures, those are the only criteria that are built in. So we're not looking at DRA compliance, we're not looking at communities of interest or council splitting, just at those basics, compact, contiguous, and population balance. Still, you see something really interesting. So let's start with Pennsylvania, since I just brought that up. And what the picture is showing you is that if you look at the pattern of how people voted, and then you ask, if I made a million different plans that I drew at random, how many seats would I expect Democrats to get in Congress? Remember again that Pennsylvania has 18 congressional seats at the moment. And so what we see in the picture, it looks like the picture might have gotten a little munched, but make sure that you have the easy to view one in the slides that are distributed. What you see is that even though that particular election had just about a 50-50 vote, so that might lead you to think that 9 seats out of 18 for Democrats would be typical. Actually, look at what's typical. You get this histogram shaped like a bell curve. And it's a lot more typical to get 5 or 6 seats for Democrats than it is to get 9. That's just telling you something about where people live in Pennsylvania and about the consequences of geography. And then, written in here are indicators telling you about various plans that people made and proposed and how many seats that they actually got. So you see that the legislature's plan, both in 2011 and their do-over plan in 2018, take that natural advantage that might exist for Republicans and squeeze it all the way to the ends of the bell curve. Whereas some of the other plans, including, I think this is funny, one that was made by an 8th grade class, an actual 8th grade class for homework. they do a lot better at reflecting the kind of alternatives, that world of alternatives. Okay, next is my home state of Massachusetts, where a proportional outcome for Republicans, if you look at certain voting patterns, would be about 1/3 of the seats. But instead, if you look at what's possible, you can make yourself a million times, a billion times, a trillion times. None of them will have any Republican seats. It's just not possible. As an artifact of where people live in Massachusetts, you can't do it. You can't make a plan like this. Okay, and I can continue, but this is the kind of thing that you can see when you do a topic. And this has come up in multiple court cases, but actually the view I'd like to focus on how you might use this before. Okay, so the main points I've made here are just that using a computer doesn't make it fancy. There's a scientific depth to getting it right. And a good algorithm is not just going to give you interesting examples, it's going to do more. It's going to weight the plans in a way that lets you sample represent. Okay, so let me take a few minutes to shift focus, as I said, to how this can help you draw good plans. Okay, so ensembles are not just for losses. So what else can they do for you? Well, they can help you measure the impacts of different rules and criteria in the plan creation process. So you might be thinking, how can a good competitiveness rule function? What would it look like to look for more competitive districts? You might think about the balance of voting rights opportunities versus county splits, to name 2 of many awesome things have in mind. You might do what I was appealing to just a moment ago and ask how the human geography of the state, restricts or maybe promotes your ability to create a proportional outcome where this is not required by law. I need to emphasize proportionality is not a requirement, but it is an expectation by the public and something that's regarded as informal measure of fairness. And so you could ask yourself, is that possible in my state? And there are so many other kinds of tests and criteria, and I think you've been hearing about many of them already. Under partisan criteria, proportionality, efficiency gap, the mean median, which is a kind of partisan symmetry score. These are some of the zoo of partisan metrics. Then there are compactness metrics, full view poplar redox, population polygon, and dozens more. And, it doesn't end there. You could look at county splits. You could look at the number of majority-minority districts. The world of ways, statistical tests that people use to measure a plan or sort of indicators for a plan. The world is large. And so what I want to emphasize is that the ensemble method can help you think about any of these. You can use it together with your favorite score to understand what's possible in your state. Just to be really brief and show a few examples. So we were asked to, my research group was asked to analyze county splits versus compactness in Virginia. So the question was, can we give a high priority to county preservation without giving up compactness? Here's a little picture of Virginia. So you can guess that the example might be yes, because the counties themselves are fairly nicely shaped. And we showed that the answer is yes. That if you actually take an ensemble and you weight it towards county preservation, it becomes more compact rather than not. Okay, so that's a way to think about trade-offs in your criteria. Here's a second example, going back to Pennsylvania. The efficiency gap. Ask me what it is if you want to hear about it. It's a popular score of partisan advantage. And yet, many of those plans that I showed you in Pennsylvania have efficiency gap scores that look very pro-Republican. Why would that be? So here's why. The universe isn't what people expected. People thought that there'd be a bell curve of efficiency gap centered around zero. And you can see in this picture that the gray mass in the background, maybe it's not quite shaped like you expect, and it's certainly not centered around zero. In fact, the efficiency gap scores over 10%, which are usually thought to be gerrymanders, are typical if you just follow the rules in Pennsylvania. So if you really want to think about a score, such as efficiency gap or any of the others, you want to use a method like this to show you what's possible. Last example, Utah just passed a reform requiring partisan chemistry be considered. And, you can ask yourself whether that would sort of fit well with the situation on the ground in Utah. And actually, it turns out that that's kind of booby trapped, because if you enforce the good mean median score in Utah, it turns out this would lock in a floor to viewed over Republican outcomes in Congress. So just beware unintended consequences. There are a lot of trendy scores out there, and some that have stood the test of time. But for any kind of score that you might want to use on your map, you're really going to want to understand what's possible, in New York State in 2020, 2021. So benchmarking with a method like this will really help you understand those principles. Okay, so what were my basic points? That if you take these ensembles, they show you what plans would tend to look like if they were constructed only by the rules that you set out. Not a uniform set of rules for the country, but your rules and your priorities. So these techniques help you explore trade-offs, to help you look for problems where some score might backfire in your state. And so overall, I think they can help you do a good job choosing rules, choosing metrics, and making plans that live up to your own goals and priorities. Okay, I included a slide of references so that you can follow some of these things up. There's some information about how to. So I have just a couple minutes left. Please be graciously let me go over. So about 2 minutes left in the session. And I'd really love if anyone had a question.
I do have a question for you from someone who sent it in privately. Moon, that is, would you recommend running a simulation before map drawing begins or afterward to compare the constructed plan to the universe of possible plans? Both, or tell us more about timing.
Yeah, that's a great question. Although I am going to do the thing where I say, please don't call them simulations, call them samples. Simulators sound like they're fake plans, but they're actually real plans, which is samples. Okay, sorry, there. Stop with my block spiel. So what's the recommendation? Should you do this after the fact? Should you do this before? So I think that's a case-by-case situation. I've talked to folks who are building their redistricting processes in several states. And in some cases, they want to kind of keep a firewall between the analyst and the map drawer so that it doesn't look like you're using this kind of algorithmic manipulation in your process. And so that model says you draw your plan and then hand it to your analyst to tell you how that does against what is impossible. But in other states, what's under consideration is a model where you fully incorporate the analyst into your design team and be looking at these kinds of benchmarks all along. So it's really a question for you thinking about process. But if you get a good scientist on board who's going to do obviously principles work, I think either model works quite well. Either the one where you cycle back and forth between plans and analysis, or where, like in Pennsylvania, what I work for Governor Wolf, you build the analytic framework up front for the plan. I think either of those.
Sounds like it could be one or the other or both. And then tell us what you can about whether software that you might buy will have measures of ensembles in the package, or if this is like an add-on, and if it's an add-on, how do they get this?
Okay, the sound cut out a little, so I just want to repeat that back to you. You're asking whether the commercial software will have this capacity built in. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I know from talking to a few of the folks who build the commercial software that has been our hope to get that built in. But actually, this comes back to, let's go back to the slide from before that says you just can't do this at the touch of a button. So you can make ensembles, but sort of making them right, knowing that you've achieved representative sampling, and kind of having all the rules customized for your state. That's the case by case part. That's the part that's kind of bespoke to your situation. So it would be my strong recommendation that you talk to one or more academic teams, and not rely on any of the commercial software to do this for you if you want to find out.
So I like that idea of using an academic, but how many other academics are there besides yourself who have the skill to do it, and how do we find them?
Yeah, that. So that was another slide. Yeah, same slide. So I listed some teams here. There are teams using what I consider, this is just my opinion as a scientist, good methods. We're at Tufts and MIT. There's a team at Duke, CMU/Pitt, UNC Greensboro, Washington State, University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado College, WashU, St. Louis, BYU, Texas State, now UT Austin. There's one starting at the University of Connecticut, and the rest is growing. And I would be absolutely happy to sort of put you in touch with teams in different places if you want to kind of compare methods and sort of think about who you'd like to work with.
Okay, that was great. That sounded like it really is spreading. That's beautiful.
It really is, yeah.
Yeah. Would you put your email address in the chat box too? I know it was on one of the slides earlier, but let's get that there.
Sure.
People want to communicate with you directly. So I want to add a comment that I heard offline. This is not in relation to what Moon said. This comment came in before Moon started speaking. And that comment was, I have been lost all morning. So if there are other people out there who have been lost on any part of this, that's okay. Any of us at NCSL are happy to pick up at any point with you and walk you through any part of it or whatever you need. We've got your back. Nobody got born knowing this stuff about redistricting, and we have the resources online, but probably best of all is to talk to Ben or Christy or me at NCSL. Moon, I'm going to say thank you to you.